The name of the program here is Schleswig, the Forgotten Years, and the program is designed to cover the very early years of Schleswig, the years when there's still no one left alive that would remember it. So the events of these years were influential in the development of the town, but we have to rely on historical references to review them. Let's start with a quick look at the land itself. For over millions of years, the land was worked and reworked to develop our soil. For tens of thousands of years, it was then crushed flat by wave after wave of glaciers. Then for thousands of more years, wind and water erosion carved it into the rolling hills that we have today. The land has supported multitudes of plants, from wildflowers to grasses that reach more than 12 feet high. The diverse mixture is constantly changing due to climate change, incorporation of invasive species is modified by fire and biological changes. The result was a rich, diverse, exuberant living mosaic of natural beauty. Animal life was equally diverse and constantly changing. It ranged from early mastodons and giant sloths to the more recent plant eaters like deer and elk, and carnivores like wolves and coyotes. It also included rabbits and squirrels and fish in the stream and birds in the trees and hundreds of species of insects buzzing around. The prairie that our first settlers found was not an empty land space. It was a land pulsating with a multitude of landforms. The land was also occupied by people. Native Americans lived in this area for more than 10,000 years, as is evidenced by their artifacts. A number of cultures and tribes developed and passed on. The most destructive influence is the arrival of European diseases, massive loss of life. Some tribes lost 60% of their population, and a few up to as much as 90%. White Indian relations would have developed entirely differently if their numbers had stayed the same. After the Louisiana Purchase, I was under the supervision of William Clark of Lewis and Clark, and he declared this area off limits to white settlement. That continued until the Black Hawk War in 1832. There were violent conflicts between the native tribes, especially the Dakota Sioux and the Squankey, although every tribe protected its territory. The only Europeans that came through in that time were French fur traders, occasionally passing through to trade with the Indians. The Boyer River was named after one of them. In 1831, a treaty conference held at Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, set up the boundaries for tribal activity in hopes of curbing some of the violence. The Dakota Sioux were given the northern part of the state, the Meskwaki and Iowa were given southeast and central, and here in the southwest was reserved for the Omaha, although they were to live west of the Missouri River, but could use this area for hunting grounds. They were later pressed into giving up the rights to these hunting grounds too. The first white settlers here had contact with the Omaha tribe. The interactions were generally peaceful. However, the two peoples did not have a very good understanding of each other's culture. White society was not always appreciative of the activities required of a nomadic lifestyle, and the Indians did not think much of whites' ideas on individual ownership of land and property. They thought it cut off one from the diversity of nature and wildlife. Neither side appreciated the other's way of preparing food, but each was very interested in the other's use of herbal medicines. The Omaha had a complex tribal structure built on clans, social relationships, and intricate rules adapted to a way of life on the plains. The leadership was divided between three traditional chiefs, each with specific duties. The first image in the lower row is Chief Iron Eye. He was one of the last traditional chiefs. He oversaw the European society becoming dominant in the 1880s. Next to him is his daughter Suzette, who is also known as Bright Eyes. She became an advocate for the tribe and embarked on a well-received speaking tour throughout the East Coast. That second daughter, Rosalie, became the business manager of the tribe when the reservations were set up. A third daughter, Susan, went to medical school and became one of the first Indians and one of the first women to become a medical doctor and had a clinic for the tribe. His son Francis graduated from college in ethnology and co-wrote a 2-volume detailed description of the Omaha culture. His work has been recognized by far away as the Humboldt Institute in Berlin, Germany. As a result, the Omaha culture is one of the best known Native American cultures. The final figure on the end of the line was one of Iron Eye's companion chiefs. He was given the name Robert Morris by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but generally he was known as Smoke. First Europeans to come through the Schleswig area was a military expedition in 1820. They were ordered to go from a fort north of Omaha to Fort Snelling near Minneapolis. Stephen Watts Carney was an officer on the expedition and kept a detailed journey of the trip. They came up the Boyer River and turned north, camping very near Schleswig here. Glenn Pollack and I were going to plan to give a presentation on this expedition at the Les Hills Prairie Seminars. But the COVID pandemic delayed our presentation, and in that delay, a new book came out. It was based on the records of Andrew Talcott, the science officer in the expedition. It was the first new information on that trip in 200 years, and it came out just at the right time. Talcott was slightly more precise on the route they took. On July 6, 1820, they camped a little southeast of Schleswig, very near the Vernon Moss Road. They came up along the Big Creek Valley, a couple miles east of Schleswig. Both officers gave reports on the landforms, the plants, the animals, and other details of the area. They said they could travel for days on the prairie without finding enough wood for a campfire. And the travel through the pothole region in northern Iowa was difficult. They were asked for the best route for a road between the two forts. Their report concluded that at that time, it was not feasible to build a road through this area. The treaties that relocated the Indian tribes resulted in a vast amount of land in the hands of the federal government. A large part was used to reward people for government services rather than pay them cash. Volunteers for military service often received land grants. Abraham Lincoln received such a grant for his service in the Black Hawk War. A monument is located on the land that's about 5 miles south of Schleswig. Jesse Dennison represented a company that bought unwanted land warrants out east and resold the lands in around here. The settlers began to trickle into this area in the 1840s. Cornelius Denham and Franklin Pierce arrived in 1849 and set up operations at Denham's Grove on the East Boyer River. They were the first that broke the trail and brought in a number of New Englanders to the area. However, there were other settlers that were moving at this time. One of the first major movements of people into this area, into this part of the state, was the Mormon Trek across southern Iowa in the 1840s. They came by the hundreds following Brigham Young to Utah. They came in groups along several trails, but usually winter camped at Gainesville, which became Council Bluffs. There were large numbers of people camped there and they needed a lot of food. They sent out hunting parties in all directions. One of their best hunters was Jesse Mason, and his favorite hunting ground was up the Boyer River, especially the woods north of Deloitte. And he sent back wagon loads of venison and elk and other food. He and his followers founded the town of Deloitte. They also had settlements at Gellens Grove and the town of Preparation in the Les Hills. The real wave of permanent settlers came with the railroad. The first transcontinental railroad reached eastern Iowa at the beginning of the Civil War, but it was paused for the duration of the war. It reached Denison in 1867. By that time, Jesse Dennison had gained full control of all the appropriate land and was one of the few people who could successfully negotiate with the railroad. The railroad got its revenge by having the railhead camp for the rest of the construction in Iowa in Denison. Thousands of rowdy construction workers easily overran the authorities of a small town of a few hundred. Denison was the wildest town in the West in those days, but no one wrote up that history. The railroad promoted and advertised for people to come and create businesses that needed rail services. One of their targets was the developed German immigrant areas in eastern Iowa. They also encouraged immigration directly from Europe. One of the last open areas to be settled is the north central area of the county. The heavy, tangled, and resistant prairie grasses in the distance from supply sources held back its development until the 1870s. The German settlers started coming into the Schleswig area in 1872 and continued to come in ever-increasing waves. It was not an easy job. The prairie had to be plowed and cross-plowed, sometimes for more than 1 year, to subdue the wild prairie plants. Only a few acres could be cleared at a time. There was not much native wood in the area, and supplies were at least a day's ride away. Many of the settlers received support from family back east or even from Europe. The underfunded usually had to move on. There were also scam artists. Some would sell an attractive bait land several times and switch land descriptions to a lower quality land, or they'd sell low quality supplies at high prices. It was a buyer's beware. It would sometimes take 2 days travel to Denison by horse and wagon to do business and then return home. Albrecht Buch saw this as an opportunity and set up a store on his farm, which grew into a town. When he applied for a post office, it was granted under the name Morgan, Iowa. The business grew. He brought in Dale Week as a blacksmith, Paul Voss to help with the store, and others. He also had 3 sons that were growing up to help. Morgan became not only the commercial center, but also a social center for the area. He built a large dance hall and tavern. He sponsored some of the traditional activities such as the Spring Kinderfest. It was the center of activities for more than 20 years. By the 1890s, the land had been settled and the farms were developed, and many families were seeing the results of their hard work and were becoming prosperous. The old town of Morgan was becoming common and dated. There was a desire for something new and more fashionable. And Jurgen Schrader provided it by starting a new town. Dr. Fuster suggested that it be named Hohenzollern after the Prussian royal family. The new town grew rapidly along 2 cross streets. A few photographs were taken of the town. This one, which clearly identified as being from the town, shows little of its extent. There are secondary ways of finding an image of it, but they'll have to wait for a little bit later. Hohenzollern was popular, and many people had fond memories of their time there. They would talk about it for many years to come. Railroads were the cutting-edge advanced technology at the time, much like computers were in the 1980s and artificial intelligence is today. To be on or near a railroad meant you had access to the wonders of the wider world and the increased opportunities for commercial success. There were many rumors of coming railroads and many suggested routes. When the railroad did come to this area, it started in Denison and went up the North River Valley to the town of Boyer, and then curved westward and southwestward through Kyron and on to Mount Damon, where it connected with the main line. It did not go to Morgan or to Hohenzollern, but bought Heinrich Zucksdorf's farm and laid a siding there. They designed and plotted a new town site. This allowed them the opportunity to sell all of the lots at a huge profit. Most of the desirable lots were auctioned in 1899. Mr. Zucksdorf suggested to name the town after the Schleswig province in Germany. And by that time, Holstein had already been taken, so Schleswig became the name. Since the farms and businesses were already established in the area, the new town got off to a quick start with almost explosive growth. The businesses in the prior towns made immediately plans to move to the railroad. In the town of Morgan, the founder, Albert Buch, was nearing retirement, but his 3 sons, Herman, Ernest, and Emil, decided to abandon their old and well-used buildings and build new ones in the new town. The Buch brothers built a substantial farm supply and implement supply business on Lower 2nd Street, a block off of Cedar Street. When the first load of lumber was brought in for the building, the young carpenter, Albert Schultz, jumped off the wagon, grabbed a couple of boards, and nailed them together. For the rest of his 90 years, he proudly claimed to have driven the first nail in the town of Schleswig. The Buch brothers' business was large and successful from the start. One evidence of this success was this pump. Gary Masick displayed it for years on his lot under a windmill frame. A closer look at the side of the pump, and it shows the name of the business. It clearly says Buch Brothers, Schleswig, Iowa. This would indicate their orders were large enough. The manufacturer was willing to customize it for them. There were various implement companies at the time. John Deere made plows, and International Harvester made binders, and so on. The Buch brothers handled most of them. And John Deere is definitely included. We'll see later. The sudden growth of the new town can be seen from this bird's eye view of the early town. The buildings were popping up all over. The house in the foreground was on the lot just west of the FAC's office and was a boarding house for workers. The large building in the center was a wagon works operated by Dale Week, the blacksmith from Morgan. The building on the right was the Noble Industrial Lumberyard. Many of the buildings that helped shape the town have disappeared. This aerial view was taken on July the 20th, 1900, in the first year of the town. On a curious note, the Wright brothers made their first airplane flight on July 10th, 1903, 3 years later. Going back a minute to Hohenzollern, Jurgen Schrader said the businessmen there decided their buildings were in pretty good shape, and most of which were less than 10 years old. They hired a company from Council Bluffs to move the best ones to the new town. Mr. Schrader obtained several lots on the 2nd Street, a block north of Cedar Street, and the first 3 buildings in this photo were actually from the town of Hohenzollern. The mile-and-a-quarter move may have been powered by a steam engine, or it may have been made with a horsepower machine. This was a frame that held the gears and a long tongue. Horses attached to the tongue would pull around in circles, turning a gear, winding a chain, and pulling the buildings. This photo, as well as showing the early popularity of music, shows a building in the background. I don't know if I can point that out very easily here. But right back in here, this building, in the background was a dance hall moved in from Hohenzollern. It was located where the funeral home is now. It did not last long and was used for other purposes before taken down. But it was the site of the last major gunfight in Schleswig. 2 groups had an argument at a dance, and one of them pulled out a gun and took a shot at a member of the other group. The victim received a scalp wound. No one was killed and no charges were filed, but the descendants of 2 prominent families disappeared for 10 years or more. This building was moved in from Hohenzollern, where it had been a blacksmith shop, but Jürgen Schrader remodeled it into his home. It's located on 1st and Birch Streets. As an architectural note, most 100-year-old homes have a sharply pitched roof, say a 30 or 35 degree angle to make it easier to ward off bad weather. Farm buildings usually had much wider roof angles. This house has a wide 45-degree roof angle, which probably was a farm building. This steel shed is the last of the 7 buildings that were moved in from Hohenzollern. It was located in the alley behind City Hall. It was part of the livery stable at Hohenzollern. It's the last remaining evidence of that historic site. The Opera House. As early as the spring of 1900, several businessmen and farmers formed a group to build a community center for the town. Their plan was as grandiose as their hopes for the town. They planned to build the largest public hall in the county. It would be 60 feet by 80 feet with a hardwood dance floor, a 60-foot stage, and a balcony that could seat up to 700. At 20-foot high ceilings, and so that heavy curtains and scenery sets could be raised upward out of the way of performances. It was a real showpiece and would host a wide variety of activities. It was completed in the fall of 1900. It was popular from the start. By February of 1901, companies like the Fremont Comedy Company were beginning to rent it for their performances. There were ads of activities like a homecoming ball in 1902. By 1904, it could attract celebrities like Iowa Governor Senator Albert Cummings when he was on a speaking tour. When the new movie industry first made films available, they were shown in the Opera House. When the new high school began and had a basketball program, they used the Opera House for a gymnasium. It had dressing rooms, but they had to return to the school for showers. It was a really busy place. In the mid-1920s, another dance hall was built a mile east of town. This was known as the Bowery and then as the Playmore. Its activities were more limited to dances. It was a fun place, just outside of the view of the rest of the community. As far as the Opera House, Dick Fredericks has a real fancy model of the house in case you haven't seen it yet. The town grew rapidly in its first years. Business and farms were already established and functioning before the town was started, so they were ready for business from the beginning. This scene is from the south end of 2nd Street looking north. On the right is a wooden hotel, a tavern, a brick hotel, and more. On the left is a grocery store that became Fast Place, a bank, and more. Horse and buggies were the main source of transportation. This scene is from the north end of 2nd Street looking south. On the right is the Hohenzollern buildings, a store, and the second bank, now the City Hall. On the left is Adolf Hansen's large leather and harness shop, a small bakery, and a brick hotel and other buildings. And this is the north side of Cedar Street looking west. On the corner is a bank, and in the south entrance to the Hollander clothing store, which later became the office of the Farmers Mutual Insurance Company. The remainder of the buildings were temporarily and removed by future development. They included Chris Cruz's hardware store, Klaus Godberg's variety store, and Nellie Porter's millinery shop. This is the north side of Cedar Street looking east. Edge of the tavern is showing, and then there's the Christensen Smith grocery store, which became the telephone office, and then this library. The wooden buildings had several uses, including a produce station and electronics store, but they were replaced. Beyond that is the doctor's building, now the spa. Recently, Larry Miller completed a research project listing all of the businesses in each location in the business district from the time town started until today. And that information will be available during the celebration that's coming up. Early public utilities. One of the first considerations of a new town was developing the necessary utilities. A water supply is a major concern. A well 10 feet wide and 442 feet deep was dug just off the alley on the west side of the United Bank of Iowa. A brick building was built over the well with rooms for city council and fire department meetings. A pressure system with a water pump and 2 steel tanks were installed in the well and could produce enough pressure to throw a stream of water 150 feet high from a 3/4 inch nozzle. Of course, that's just a little bigger than a garden hose. It also provided water for the business district and nearby homes. Most of the homes dug their own wells. In 1910, the city erected a 100-foot water tower by the well. Within a few years, the state health authorities forced the closing of that well. There were too many horse barns and outhouses in the vicinity that could pollute the water. A large shallow well was dug on the southeast edge of town. It took a while in normal years, but it fell short in dry years. As the town grew, it became a serious problem, and in 1934 they dug a deep well a mile west of town. It provided plenty of water, but its quality was sometimes questionable. One of the early services for the town was a gas generating plant located on the corner of Cedar and Maple Streets. Chemicals and water were mixed in an underground tank and carbonic gas was generated. A series of lead pipes transported the gas to the businesses, several homes, and some streetlights. The Schleswig Telephone Company was organized in 1902 and set up 60 miles of phone lines connecting businesses, homes, and some farms. Its first office was in the second floor of the Schrader building, and as its service expanded, it was moved a number of times. Gas lights and gasoline engine pumps were becoming dated technology, so the Schleswig City Council decided to build an electric power generating plant at 114 Nash Street and hired John Jaxo to operate it. It had both a 50 and 75 horsepower generators, and was soon connected to all the businesses and homes in town. The electric rates were relatively high, but we were on the cutting edge of technology. Over time, it proved too expensive to operate and was sold to the Iowa Light, Heat, and Power Company in 1925, which later became the Iowa Public Service Company. Mr. Jaxel stayed on as its manager. There were other concerns. Concrete drainage curves had been laid along the streets, but the streets themselves were mainly dirt and gravel. They could be dusty or muddy and had to be dragged smooth. Many people also thought that a sewer system that did not depend on outhouses would be a good goal for the community. But for a new town, those services would have to wait their turn. Here is Iowa Governor Carroll. He's the, let's go back here. He's the gentleman right here on the stand, addressing a crowd on 2nd Street. And on the top of the hill, there's a large building back up here. That was the Seward Lumberyard. The Hollander Motor Building replaced it. In the aerial view of Schleswig, we had shown that the Noble and Dressel Lumberyard on East Birch Street. There's a large demand for building materials in a new town with a prosperous farming community. The demand was really large, and the Green Bay Lumber Company came in across the street from the Stewart Lumberyard. The first manager was Fred Gergol. He was involved in a number of activities in Schleswig and helped set up the phone company and had many social and kind of cultural activities. He was a very prominent figure in town and was proud of it. He was one of the first persons in town to have a motor car, but unfortunately, he wasn't very good at controlling it. One day when he was driving, he met farmer Fred Jepson on a horse-drawn wagon, and Mr. Gergol forced Mr. Jepson and his wagon into the ditch. And he made kind of light of the situation. That did not sit well with Mr. Jepson. And the more he thought about it, the more upset he became. So he got some of his friends and neighbors together, and they decided to do something about it. They organized a new company and started a competing lumberyard. Farmers Lumber and Coal Company was started. It was built next to the railroad, and the coal could be loaded directly into bins, and the lumber products would be stored nearby. The office and hardware department were in the central building, and commercial feed was stored in the side building. And I remember as a kid, I always liked walking past that commercial feed building because the feeds had a molasses content, and it's always a nice sweet smell coming out of there. When the coal was no longer needed, they switched to grain and became the Farmers Lumber and Grain Company. One unique feature was when they organized the corporation and they issued stock, but each shareholder could have one vote in the company no matter how many shares they owned. And that way, no one could buy enough shares to dominate the company. And they stayed closer to the needs of the community. It outlasted all the other lumberyards in town and lasted nearly until the farm crisis of the 1980s. At the very beginning of the town, there were two large grain elevators built along the tracks. The first one was owned by the Noble and Dessel Company, which also owned the lumberyard on the other side of the tracks. The second elevator was owned by the Nye, Schneider, and Fowler Company, which advertised a large range of products. The first elevator was a really tall building, and way at the top up here, they had a window way up there. And a person up there with a camera could get an interesting aerial view of the entire town. Unfortunately, that building burnt down, and the office that was with it was used as a shop for many years by Siegfried Kettleson, a well-known carpenter in town. The second building, the Nye, Schneider, and Fowler elevator, was sold to the Farmers Lumber Company when they switched to becoming the Farmers Lumber and Grain Company. History of religion in Schleswig evolves around these two men, the Reverend Emil Hansen and the Reverend Gottlieb Haar. However, for a bit of background, general background anyway, I'd like to summarize a program that we had here on the library a few years ago. By the end of the Middle Ages, there was a great deal of ferment within the church. Then 500 years ago, the Protestant Reformation was triggered by Martin Luther. It was proliferated by John Calvin, Zwingli, Cranmer, and more. The works of Erasmus were reforming the Catholic Church. There were many new denominations, and there was a great deal of religious fervor. There was forced participation by political leaders and even devastating religious wars. Conditions did settle down, and 200 years ago, there was a movement in Europe to unify the Christian churches. Over time, some Lutheran and Calvinist reform groups did merge. Not everyone joined the group. One that did not was the Missouri Synod Lutherans. Now back to the Reverend Hansen and the Reverend Haar. They were both itinerant ministers traveling through and preaching in the early days of this community. 5 years after Schleswig was established, the Reverend Hansen was able to organize a congregation and build the German Evangelical Lutheran Church. After some time, they joined the ecumenical movement and became the Evangelical and Reformed ENR Church, which is also known as the Freedom Church of Peace. Reverend Hansen stayed on to become its first minister. After more mergers, it became the United Church of Christ. The Reverend Haar energetically promoted and organized a number of congregations. He emphasized the rural areas. That's where most of the people actually were living at the time, it was on the countryside. He developed congregations including Hanover, Grant, Soldier, and more. He organized congregations and recruited ministers, but he did not stay on. He moved on to become an influential leader in the Missouri Synod organization. After 13 years, the Emmanuel Lutheran Church was established in Schleswig. There was also a Catholic presence, but they were on the border of three parishes, Denison, Charter Oak, and Ida Grove, and a local parish was not established. An important social institution in town was the local saloon. And the upper picture is the first saloon in Schleswig, the Brogan Saloon. It was located on the corner where the post office is now. The town's growth rapidly caused this business to outgrow its building. It was not long before plans were made to replace it with a larger facility. However, they did not want to give up their favorite recreational center. So they did not immediately tear down the old building. Instead, They moved it into the street and continued to use it as a saloon until the new building was ready to be opened. When the Crockett building was completed in 1906, it was dominated that corner for the next 60 years. Volunteer fire departments were one of the first essential organizations in town. They developed regional associations to encourage and support each other. The Schleswig is part of the Maple Valley Firemen's Association. The association had annual tournaments to maintain its public image, to test its skills, and to have a good social event. Schleswig hosted the event on June the 23rd of 1909. Things went quite well until people started getting sick. A lot of people were getting sick, very sick. Many did not recover quickly, and doctors became quite concerned. Dr. Schultz turned his house into a hospital and recruited nurses from as far away as Council Bluffs. Some of the worst cases were bedridden for weeks, even months. The symptoms ranged from loss of hair to perforated intestines. Ella Hansen, a 15-year-old girl, had been weakened by the disease and needed an operation, but she did not survive it. In the Midway community near Battle Creek, young Dora Elbers also died because of this disease. The official inquiries said it appeared to be typhoid fever. But typhoid fever is a water-based disease, and all of the water tests showed no signs of typhoid contamination. The unofficial rumor was that it was food poisoning, possibly from the potato salad made in the restaurant but from the Brick Hotel. It may have been improperly made or improperly stored in copper pots. People had strong views on this subject, and I recall even 70 years later, if you brought up that subject, you could raise a good argument. An educational system was also an early concern of the town. The county had already set up a network of country schools. The town soon saw the need for a school in town. The question was where to build it. The town had been built around the railroads plan, which is the smaller plan up there. And as the town expanded, a row of blocks was added on the north and on the west sides. And in the east side, the land was plotted out, but it hadn't been developed yet. So at the time, a serious effort was made to build a school. Most of the prominent businessmen lived in the original part of town, and they would like to have the new school in their area, so their children would have to go so far to school. However, many on the school board favored a place in the eastern part of the town where more land could be bought at an affordable price. They could afford an entire city block with enough room for future expansion. But the businessmen devised a plan to stop that idea. They each bought a lot in each of the square blocks in the eastern part of the town, so the school board could not get a full block. But the school board was not going to put up with that, so they decided they did not need a full block and could have a good schoolyard in half a block. So they decided to buy the land in the block where Theodore Rohr, the banker, had bought his lot. Theodore Rohr did build a house on that lot, and he did have all the noise and activity and commotion of the school right in his backyard. The school started with 8th grades and added 3 years of high school courses by 1909, but the first 4-year graduation didn't occur until 1920. The first school building was an impressive wooden structure. It included a variety of improvements and functioned well. However, it caught fire and burned down October the 26th of 1911. In 1912, they immediately built a new replacement, and they used the same building plan as the old one, but this time they built it out of bricks, and they built it to last. As the town grew or continued to grow, so did the needs for the school. In 1918, they doubled the size of the building by adding an addition on the back side. In 1940, they added a new gymnasium and additional classrooms. The school continued to grow and expand, of course, but that's beyond the course tonight, our program tonight. People of Schleswig have long enjoyed social events and celebrations. There are many individual birthday parties, anniversary parties, and barn dances. Larger activities were held in the Opera House, including holiday balls and costume parties and more. There are also community-wide celebrations. One was the Kinderfest, or Children's Day. Actually started 400 years ago in Germany and celebrated in most German immigrant communities in the spring after the crops had been planted. It was celebrated in Morgan and continued in Schleswig. However, in the 1920s, it became overshadowed by other concerns and was discontinued for a while. Another widespread celebration was German Day. It was a time to celebrate your German heritage. It was celebrated in many communities. In Crawford County, it was centered mainly in Denison. However, over the years, they began to allow it to languish. In 1914, Schleswig challenged them, claiming we could put on a better celebration. On October 6th and 7th of that year, the town was filled with stands and acts and activities. Special excursion trains brought in hundreds of spectators. It was a huge celebration and an overwhelming success. One of the town's most long-lasting activities started with this ad in the Schleswig Library in 1910. Little Lizzie is talking on the latest version of the telephone. She asked Santa Claus when he will be in Schleswig, and Santa replied, "I'll be there on Saturday, December 21st. I will leave Chicago at midnight and arrive at your town at 2:40 the next afternoon. So tell all your brothers and sisters and all your friends to meet me at the depot. I will have presents for everyone. My headquarters will be at the C. Gottberg store, and that store will be open every night until Christmas." Klaus Gottberg was a very early businessman in Schleswig, and by 1910 he built his second large building on Cedar Street just west of what would become Fat's Place. His Santa Claus Day brought in huge crowds. He had a rope-operated freight elevator in the rear of the store, and at the right time, Santa would ride it down from the second floor. It wasn't exactly a sleigh ride from the North Pole, but for most of the kids, it was close enough. The crowd got so large that Mr. Gottberg was unable to handle it in the store. Other merchants in town wanted in on the activity. It was bringing lots of business to town. In 1920, Santa Claus Day went public, and Santa arrived in the back of a truck in the street. Over the years, there have been a number of variations. Free movies were offered in the theater, and some stores offered specials. In recent years, he's appeared in the community building. One of the things that remained constant was a bag of goodies for each child. When the railroad first laid out the town plan, they wanted Cedar Street to be the main commercial street. But when the businesses from Morgan and Hohenzollern set up on either end of 2nd Street, that became the commercial center. Several businesses had set up on West Cedar Street, but by 1910 or 12, these locations became less desirable. So when Dr. Schultz wanted to clear the west half of the block for his new home and a clinic, there was little opposition. Nellie Porter's millinery shop was taken down. Klaus Gottberg built a new, larger building, which we have seen as the Santa Claus location. The last building was Chris Cruz's 2-story hardware building. The plan was to move it across the street and set it up there. It had been a 1-story building to which a 2nd story had been added later, making it structurally questionable. When they did get it moved and were ready to set it down, the weaker first floor collapsed, and it killed Peter Burke and injured Ben Olson. When the building was stabilized, it became a 1-story building. A large shop was added in the rear, and Emil Boak, the last of the Boak brothers, partnered with Charles Jurgensen and operated a John Deere dealership there. Years later, they sold it to Earl Stern and Son, who eventually moved it to a new building. This building then became the Brockton Produce Station. This is the street scene on the right, showing the 3 buildings that were brought in from Hohenzollern. They were there until 1913. The stores were closed for Christmas that year, so the day before they really stoked up the furnace so the store would have heat over the holidays. But they overdid it a little, and the building caught fire, and it spread to all 3 buildings. And even though the fire department had the latest in firefighting equipment, and that was the latest in firefighting equipment at the time, the fire had a good start before it was noticed, and there was little chance of controlling it. The fire spread and burned down all 3 buildings. The fire was so hot that the heat broke the windows in the brick hotel across the street. There had been fires before, but this one left quite a hole in the town's commercial district. As we've seen, the people of Schleswig were socially active and would cooperate in activities, and they also liked to join organizations. These were some of the organizations that were popular in German communities. They were especially popular among recent immigrants. Recent immigrants had a place where they could find people with a similar background and languages who could help them transition into a new country. The first one on the top is a symbol of the Turner variety, which has started as an acrobatic society and expanded into music programs and political activities. They put on dramatic performances incorporating acting, acrobatics, and music. They were very popular in Manning and Holstein, and they did put on performances here in town, but they never organized a chapter at Schleswig. The next three organizations were quite active at Schleswig. We'll talk a little about each in turn. They were the Sons of Herman, the Modern Woodsmen of America, and the Independent Order of Oddfellows. The Oddfellows actually were founded in England, but they grew rapidly in the United States and were worldwide, and they were quite active in Schleswig. When the north end of 2nd Street burned down, the Oddfellows stepped up to fill in the gap. They built a new building on the corner, had a bowling alley in the basement, a bar and cafe on the first floor, and a huge meeting room with a dance floor on the second level. It was the dominant building on that corner for the next 100 years. Willie Schrader returned to town and built a pool hall next to it, and a movie theater filled in the gap. The Oddfellows became one of the main fraternities in town for quite a number of years. It finally faded out during the Second World War. The Sons of Herman was active in the community's early days. Herman was a German folk hero. In Roman times, Herman enlisted in the Roman army and learned much about their way of fighting. When Rome decided to invade Germany, Herman organized the German tribes into a fighting force that totally demolished 3 Roman legions in the year 9 AD. And that was at a time when Jesus was a mere lad. The defeat was so decisive that the location of the battle was lost to history until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 1980s. In addition to social activities, the Sons of Herman provided funeral services for its members. The black ribbon indicates a memorial ribbon signifying that the deceased was a member of the organization. They may have had grave markers too, but they have disappeared. The organization dissolved in this part of the country during the anti-German feeling going into World War I. They are still active in Ohio and in Texas and in California, but I wasn't able to find too much about their activities there. The Modern Woodmen of America was a very popular group in its day. In addition to the standard features of a fraternity, they sponsored a close order drill team. Instead of rifles and military equipment, the Foresters drill team used axes and mauls and woodworking equipment. They were asked to perform in other communities and various parades. When World War I started, the drill team breezed through basic training, and they were some of the first American troops to enter combat and served in much of the heavy fighting during the war. After the war, most of the members wanted nothing more to do with the military. The drill team dissolved, and they donated their practice grounds to the city. And the city transformed the practice grounds into the city park. Many people had already had picnics there while they were watching the Foresters drill team practice. Iowa has a long history of the prohibition of liquor sales. Liquor sales were prohibited in the 1880s, but it was difficult to enforce. Then a law was passed to allow saloons if they paid a special mute tax. A major change occurred when the mute tax exemption was repealed, and all the saloons, including those in Schleswig, were closed in 1916, years before national prohibition. In Schleswig, the saloon was converted to a candy kitchen. Adolf Hansen Harness Shop was a long-time fixture on North 2nd Street. Mr. Hansen provided an essential service to the community, depended on horsepower for transportation and for farming. There was strong need for new harnesses and for repairing and conditioning existing harnesses. Mr. Hansen's Harness Shop also played a role in another interesting feature of Schleswig's history. One of the best known and most respected artists and illustrators in the nation was William Henry David Kerner. Many of his paintings appeared in magazine covers, especially the Saturday Evening Post. Mr. Kerner was born in Germany but raised in Clinton, Iowa, where many of the Schleswig families originated. He was known for the quality of his and accuracy in the details of his work. The American West became his major theme. When the movie industry first came into being, they relied on Mr. Kerner's paintings for many of its images and costumes of cowboy activity. At one point in his career, he discovered that cowboys in the 1870s and 1880s used what was called a mature saddle. He wanted to use one as a model in his studio, but they had become obsolete years before, and he was not able to find one. Then one of his friends did find one in Adolf Hansen's harness shop in Schleswig, Iowa, and he used it in his studio. The Schleswig saddle was used in Kerner's studio until his death in 1938. At that time, Mrs. Kerner closed and locked the studio, and it was sealed until her death 20 years later. Her children then opened it to the public, and they made a deal with the Buffalo Bill Museum of the West in Cody, Wyoming. The museum wanted to reproduce the studios of three of the best Western artists, Frederick Remington, Charles Sharp, and William Henry David Kerner. Kerner's studio and the Schleswig saddle were on display for 30 years, from 1978 through 2008. It's now in storage. The museum was gracious enough to send me this picture of the Schleswig saddle. One of the most stressful times in Schleswig's history was the lead up to the First World War. World War I started in Europe in 1914. People of German background here felt the growing suspicion and discrimination by their fellow citizens, which intensified when the United States entered the war in April of 1917. While in town, life was near normal, but they faced hostility whenever leaving the community and seldom ventured away alone. In May the 23rd, 1918, Iowa Governor William Harding issued a proclamation forbidding Iowans from using foreign languages in public places or even on the telephone. And Saturday, July the 13th, 1918, County Special Marshal Nielsen came to Schleswig to place English only posters on all businesses and public places. A crowd of protesters gathered, and violence was narrowly avoided when cooler heads prevailed and Marshal Nielsen was allowed to complete his rounds and leave town. The English only laws were declared unconstitutional later in 1923. On August the 1st of 1918, the town hall meeting was called at the theater to decide how to handle the mounting pressure on our people in our community. Many people expressed views. Judge John Connor was even invited to explain the process of changing the town's name if they decided to do so. After much talk, they decided to do everything they could to support the country, the war effort, and to show our loyalty, but they would not give up the name of their town, or their customs, or their language. The discrimination was not over, but the community had a stronger sense of identity in which to face it. In September, the railroad schedules dropped the name Schleswig and used only stop number 18. Holstein became stop number 16. In Schleswig, welfare societies were established to prepare care packages for the troops and for the Red Cross. The most dramatic event occurred on October the 6th of 1918. Word was received that an armed caravan of hot-headed men was heading for Schleswig to force a name change, eliminate the German language, and make them all good Americans in one quick action. They were met by Mayor Jimmy Schultz, standing alone on a platform in the main intersection. He welcomed them and explained to them that the people of Schleswig were loyal Americans and supported our troops and the country. He cited our boys who had enlisted in the army and the war bonds that had been bought. And as he spoke, the rowdies began to notice that from every window, every doorway, from every alley, and over every fence, there was a gun barrel pointed at them. But restraint was the word of the day, and the mayor concluded his remarks and thanked the rowdies for coming and wished them a good trip home. And by that time, they thought that might not be a bad idea. When Crawford County National Guard was first called up for war duty, it was ordered to report to the Ida Grove Armory to be regrouped and sent on for training. On the way, they stopped in Schleswig and were greeted with speeches and additional supporters. A 114-car procession arrived unannounced in Ida Grove with the Denison Band, the Schleswig Band, and a parade of National Guards performing a close order drill. Approximately 60 young men from the Schleswig area volunteered or were drafted during the war. 4 of them lost their lives during the conflict. John Jacobson, Henry Rossi, Emil Bendixson, and Erhard Miguelson lost their lives. Herman Irwin was reported missing, but a week later the report was corrected. There is no accurate report of how many soldiers from here were injured or disabled. The Spanish flu also happened in 1918. It was first reported in Fort Riley, Kansas, and spread rapidly through the military. Approximately 50 million people died from the affliction worldwide, compared to 15 million deaths from World War I. Locally, the first cases were reported in Hanover Township, southwest of Schleswig, with about 30 active cases, which soon were up to 75 cases. The Schleswig mayor and boards of health took action. Schools were closed and public gatherings were prohibited. Businesses like pool halls could only sell cigars and soft drinks in bottles. Within weeks, the number of cases had reached 175 and then to 400. They included Dr. Henry Jones, who developed a mild case. But as the death tolls increased, funerals were suspended, and it appears that all of the deaths were not recorded. There are grave sites that are located on farms in the surrounding countryside. Active middle-aged adults were the most vulnerable to the disease. There were many tragic stories. One of the most tragic was one of the Lose family. The Henry Lose family lost 4 adults within 10 days. One was Elvira Hollander's father. They all died after about a week of becoming sick. Many local families were affected by the disease, but fortunately it seemed to have dissipated by 1919. When word of the last serviceman, Sailor Ben May, was scheduled to return, a homecoming celebration was set for December 3rd and 4th of 1919. A large arc was built over 2nd Street, and the platform around the flagpole on the main intersection was expanded, and every business was elaborately decorated. The problem occurred when the rope on the flagpole stuck at the top. But a young farmer, Albert Miller, was able to shimmy all the way up the 60-foot pole to loosen it. I'm sure no one of you here remembers seeing a flagpole in the middle of our main intersection out here. But Ingrid Finn here has made drawings of the school, and they moved that flagpole from the intersection here to the front of the school. And those images do show that flagpole. On the first day of the celebration, a huge crowd came to see a very long parade, including 150 servicemen in uniform providing a demonstration of close order marching. There were speeches, balloon ascensions, parachute jumps, but that evening's ball game with hosting was rained out. On the second day, the Des Moines Concert Band performed. There was a second parade. There was ring riding, a tug of war, and a ball game, and athletic exhibitions such as a man pulling a car with a robe in his teeth. Mayor Jimmy Schultz pulled off a surprise attraction. He had proposed to Alice Miner, a nurse from Omaha, and when she accepted, they were married on a stage in the middle of the main intersection before a surprised and delighted crowd of 8,000 people. That evening, there was a magnificent fire display, and the servicemen had been welcomed home in grand style. The First World War created a large demand for agricultural products. Our expanded army needed an increased food supply. Export demands increased as European farmland was battle devastated and their farmers were drafted into service. Trade routes were also disrupted. Government programs like the Agricultural Extension Service and the Federal Food Administration encouraged increased farm production. Commodity prices rose rapidly. Farm income increased by nearly 300%. These were good times, good years on the farm, and they continued for a few years after the war. In 1921, for example, Schleswig shipped over 800 train carloads of livestock to market. For the next 50 years, farm organizations worked to achieve parity with the income level that was achieved at that time. Parity became the key word for many farm programs in the future, but it was never quite achieved. It was an optimistic time, and people were feeling good and were looking for a way to express it. One of the ways they did express it was to organize a community fair and a livestock expedition. In 1922, Schleswig held one of the largest fairs in this part of the state. The committee raised over $5,000 to cover expenses, and that would be equivalent of $93,000 today. There were competing divisions for every type and breed of livestock, for fruits, vegetables, and grass. Over August the 24th and 25th of 1922, 15,000 people visited the fair and enjoyed many of the free acts, games, dances, and there were 3 different bands performing. A farmer on a platform by a horn of planning expressed the theme, Schleswig feeds the world. For a major division, judges were brought in from Iowa State University, and a fantastic fireworks display was contracted from Chicago. It was carried off without a hitch, but by 1924, prices had declined and the community was not able to raise the money or the cooperation to repeat the fair. In 1925, the issue of public utilities came up again. The water system had been expanded to many homes. It had been expanded, but many homes still had their own wells and cisterns. Outhouses were the main sanitary structure. Streets were still dirt and gravel. Many of the community's leaders were proud of Schleswig, but felt it had not been keeping up with the times. A plan was developed to extend the water lines to service the entire town, including hydrants for fire protection. A sewer system would include most of the towns and drain into a sewage treatment plant. The streets would be hard surfaced with the best possible system available. It was a major civic improvement project. To finance it, each property owner would be assessed the cost of the project past his place. I had met with overwhelming approval. The only disputes involved if a vacant lot should have to pay as much as a going business and so on. When future values and estimates were made and the adjustments came in, the whole project was finally approved and the work began in 1926. The Western Asphalt Paving Company was contracted to do the work. They used a process called Warrantite monolithic pavement with a concrete pan for a base. It was filled with a tar pitch compound infused with large quartzite aggregate. Over the asphalt, a seal coating was completed the process. With it, Schleswig had one of the most advanced street systems in the area. Brass plates were mounted in the alleys, entries, and on all of the streets. However, over the years, they've disappeared. One was recently offered on the internet. It was valued at $500, and they said it may be the only one left outside of the Smithsonian Institution. But of course, we still have one here in the library too. An advanced street system was selected and landowners' assessments went well. Controversy did develop, however. When a civil engineer developed a set of blueprints for the project, it became apparent that the buildings on the west side of 2nd Street had been built below the street's grade level. The business owners in that area objected to having to raise their buildings if it were even possible. Some of the leading citizens also objected to the level of the streets past their homes. Some thought the streets were too high or others too low. When the contractors arrived to begin work, the blueprints had disappeared. Rather than start all over, they allowed each landowner to determine the street level past his place. The result is, the west side of 2nd Street is almost impossible to park on in the wintertime. And some residential areas have been subject to flooding. Over 40 years later, the blueprints were discovered in one of the businesses, but at the time it was being transferred. But by then it was too late to make any changes. Post-war farm prices declined as the demand for commodities subsided, and then there was a build-up production that brought on surpluses. New conservative government quickly dropped all incentive programs. The effects of these changes were felt throughout the country. In Schleswig, the German bank, then called the Commercial Bank, closed in 1927 in a futile attempt to save its parent bank, the Crawford County State Bank. The Great Depression was coming to farm country early. With all of the problems and activities in the community, there was a welcome diversion. A local boy was making it big on the national scene. George Pipgrass was a starting pitcher for the New York Yankees baseball team. He was born and grew up here. His father, William Pipgrass, had served in a variety of businesses, including running the Brick Hotel, operating a meat market and a car dealership before moving to Anthon, Iowa. After serving in the Army during the World War, George worked his way up the farm team system to gain a spot on the Yankees. He was one of the hardest throwing and fastest pitchers in the game. He led the American League in 1928 with 24 wins. He had 3 wins in World Series games. He ended his career in 1935 by throwing a pitch so hard that he broke his arm. He then went on to become an umpire, which included working World Series games. At one time, it was said to control the game, he ejected 17 players. That's almost enough for the starting lineup of both teams. Weak farm prices began to affect farm income levels all over. The value could be added by feeding grain through livestock. Originally, this was used to ease transportation costs, but now the value added was necessary to make a living. Livestock had long been a key feature of the local economy, as was shown in 1922 fair and the hundreds of train carloads of livestock shipped each year. Not only the quantity, but the quality of the product had long been recognized. This was really brought home in 1931 when John D. Moeller won the International Livestock Show in Chicago. It was a major event and the town turned out to express its congratulations. A celebration program was held in the Opera House on December 17, 1931. More than 1,000 people attended. Speakers included Mr. Anderson of the American Hereford Cattle Breeders Association, Charles Curtis, Dean of Agriculture from Iowa State College, and others. Bands played and the mood was high. In 1929, the stock market crashed, as the farm prices had earlier, and soon there was no value in anything. The country turned to the Democrats of Franklin Roosevelt to bring the country back. A bank holiday closed all the banks and allowed only the strong ones to reopen. New programs for the time were started to put money back in the economy. The Farm Holiday Organization wanted to increase commodities by holding products off of the market. Then they went to penny auctions. At farm foreclosure auctions, they bid pennies on each item and left them for the farmer to start over. However, the creditors lost money and regular bidding had to be suppressed. At Joe Shields' farm auction near Denison on April the 28th, 1933, a riot broke out while trying to suppress the bidding. A sale was canceled and the National Guard placed the county under martial law. When the sale was resumed, the National Guard, including a machine gun post, kept order. Bayoneted guardsmen encouraged people to keep moving and not congregate on the streets. 64 people were arrested and jailed and fined, and the guard Camp McRae was set up in the county. If you'd like to see a better picture of the Joe Shields farm sale, stop up at Perkins Hotel, Cafe and Restaurant in Sioux City on Gordon Drive, just across from Menards. They have a series of old photographs in it there, and one of them is the Joe Shields farm sale with a machine gun showing it behind the crowd. A murder in Sussex. 18-year-old Lewis Heyman was desperate for money in 1934. Finding steady work was difficult, and he was pressured to repay a loan. His father had died, and his mother was employed as a live-in housekeeper. Lewis was staying with his grandmother, Mrs. Charlotte Evers. And when she refused to give him money, he made plans to steal it. And in the process, he bludgeoned her to death. It was Sunday, February the 11th, 1934. Then he went uptown where he ran into a cousin and asked for a ride back to the house where they discovered the crime. They contacted Marshal Jim Davis, who had called Sheriff Hugo Willey, Dr. Jones, and Colonel John Gottberg to investigate the scene. There was little evidence at the scene, but when Lewis could not account for all his activities that evening, he was taken to the courthouse and held for questioning. On Monday, Iowa State Bureau of Investigation agent Paul Gerber and other crime scene investigators checked the scene. After hours of intensive questioning by Mr. Gerber, Lewis confessed. On Tuesday evening, February the 13th, 1934, Judge Pinker held a special court session. County Attorney Andrew Bell presented the case against Lewis. Attorney Page was appointed defense counsel. Several witnesses were heard, but Lewis's detailed confession was determinative. Just 48 hours after the crime, Lewis was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. State investigator Paul Gruber wrote a detailed but enhanced story about the crime, which was published in Inside Detective magazine. Lewis became a model prisoner and after many years achieved trustee status. He was transferred to minimum security confinement, and after nearly 40 years, he was released as an elderly man. I had a chance to visit with him briefly before he passed away, and he was quite an interesting character. After decades of living under the restraints of the economic depression, people were ready for some relief. And when the depression showed signs of easing and Schleswig was approaching its 40th anniversary, it was a signal for a celebration, and Schleswig was ready to celebrate. The celebration lasted 3 days, July 27th, 28th, and 29th of 1939. Total attendance reached 20,000 people. The planners had pulled out all of the stops. There were free rides for the kids, large variety of free street acts, amateur talent contests, antiques display, and concerts by the Schleswig and Vale bands. They had a dance each evening and raffled off a car. The entertainment included performances by Lem and Martha from WHO Radio's popular Iowa Barn Dance Frolic program. There were also the multi-talented Fraser family performance and many other recognized named acts. Every businessman displayed its history, and all of the activities were greeted with enthusiasm, and the celebration was considered a huge success. One of the interesting note was the efforts to advertise the event. A car parade with a loudspeaker spent a whole day visiting a dozen neighboring towns. And there was a campaign to promote having each resident write to someone they knew each week, inviting them to the celebration. In 1937, 22-year-old Mabel Fritz from Holstein applied for the music instructor's job at the Schleswig High School. The all-male school board was not sure about hiring such a young girl for such a busy position. To be taken seriously, Miss Fritz offered to work on consignment. If her work was not satisfactory, they need not pay her. And on that basis, they hired her. And what a bargain they got. In the first year, she organized the band and worked to get them new uniforms and conducted street concerts in town. In 1938, she took the band to the regional music contest and was awarded a superior rating. In 1939, they advanced to a superior rating in a state music contest and qualified to compete in the national music contest in Minneapolis, where they got a 3rd place rating. They would have done better, but one section of the judging was based on what was called sight reading competition. They were given an unfamiliar piece of music, and the band director was given a few minutes to make arrangements with her band members, and then a few minutes for them to understand their parts, and they had to perform the piece. Our young band did its best, but the competition from the larger and more experienced schools was tough. In 1940, the band again received a superior rating in the state contest, with individuals receiving first. They qualified again for the national music contest, this time in Kansas City. But again, their competition held them to a 3rd place, which on a national level just isn't too bad. There were some of the soloists that also received seconds. In 1941, Mabel Fritz, who had performed with the Sioux City and the Fort Dodge Symphony Orchestras, was able to bring in nationally known conductor Carl King to conduct a week-long music workshop. At the conclusion, the Schleswig Band performed a concert of Mr. King's original compositions. Carl King had started out with the Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show, and then the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus before taking over the Fort Dodge Symphony Orchestra. In early of 1942, our band earned 1st place in a state music contest. However, Miss Fritz had been offered a job by that time with a Morningside College band, and she had accepted. She did return later to lead the band in the Kinderfest celebration that spring. In 1943, she married Dr. William Sherbrill of Odebolt and spent the rest of her life teaching and mentoring music in Odebolt. Many of her music students here stayed together, and they became the basis of Schleswig's Little German Band, which is still performing today. World War II. The same political forces that caused havoc in the farm prices after World War I deepened the Great Depression also caused international problems. They demanded that the German people be punished for taking part in the First World War. As a result, the extreme economic distress and suffering in Germany made it possible for the violent Nazi Party to get a foothold, and that led to World War II. Fighting in Europe started in 1939, when the Nazi and fascist forces began attacking their neighbors. Crawford County had early fighters to help save Spain in 1939. Their exploits were reported in the Spotlight magazine. With that feature shows some of the fighters that were in Spain at that time. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the rest of the nation joined the war. World War II engaged the efforts of the entire community. All the males between 18 and 35 had to register for the draft. Rationing of food, gasoline, tires, and clothing required lifestyle changes. With American soldiers fighting on two fronts around the globe, the families and friends were anxiously awaiting reports from the war of its progress and of its casualties. For a quick review of the war at the time, below, the first image down below is of Europe at the time the U.S. entered the war. And let's see. The fascist countries at the time we entered controlled all of the beige and tan countries that were listed here, ranging from Spain to France to Austria to Poland to Romania, all of the Scandinavian countries, and all across North Africa. The only countries that they weren't under their control was England and Russia, and they were under attack. The second image down here shows the events after we got into the war. Generals Patton and British General Montgomery came into North Africa and fought their way across North Africa through Sicily, up through Italy, and into Germany from the south. At the meantime, General Eisenhower and Bradley were creating an army in England and came across France, Netherlands, and into Germany from the west. And Russia was coming in with an army from the east. And when they converged, the war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the Japanese controlled all the area inside of this red line. It was almost all of the Western Pacific area. And their next logical step was to take Hawaii. And if they were able to do that, they would control all of the Pacific Ocean. But that brought us into the war. And our efforts started with Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur down here taking Guadalcanal and the Philippines, sort of island hopping up toward the Japanese mainland. When fighting got too tough on one island, they'd skip past it, cut off supplies to it, and take the next island. The second front had troops coming in from Midway and through Iwo Jima on their way to the Japanese mainland. And the Japanese homeland would have been one of the bloodiest battles that the world has ever seen if it had taken place. But President Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb, and that ended the war at the time. This would not be a short, quick war as it had been in 1918. It would be longer and involve more Americans. In 1942, Hans Bierman posted on his store window the pictures of 48 area men in the armed services. In the following year, double more of the men were called into service. Schleswig beat all the quotas for war bonds that were set for it. Every piece of scrap metal was saved for the war effort. Food production was increased on the farm and through the farms and through victory gardens. Our servicemen were represented in almost every major campaign. There were so many of them, they would run into each other in odd places. Herbie Reeson ran into his brother Ernie in Australia. Magnus Johansson found John Witt in Italy. There were innumerable individual stories of sacrifice, heroic efforts, and the pain and suffering in combat situations. Some spent difficult times in prisoners of war camp, such as Bill Wastrin and Glenn Johansson. Quite a number would write to the Schleswig leader explaining as much as they could about what their experiences were. Some veterans wrote about their experiences later, and their narratives are here in the library. Leslie Grell named a B-17 bomber after the Schleswig leader. It flew 82 consecutive missions over Germany, but on its last flight, it came in with an engine on fire, which consumed the entire plane. John Reimers named his military truck the Schleswig. Not everybody made it home, however. There's not a specific list of Schleswig casualties. There is a list of deaths from the general area with more than a dozen names on it, but that may not be complete, and some of them may not be associated with Schleswig, but they all did sacrifice for their country. The first major casualty from Crawford County was Vernon Voss. He died of his wounds on October the 29th, 1942. A monument was dedicated to him, and a road south of town was named in his honor. The nation gearing up for the war extinguished the last vestiges of the Great Depression. With it came a new attitude. Not only was the country reorganizing for war, but it had taken a fresh look at what changes were possible. The fear of trying anything new was over. Major changes were happening in Schleswig. The old tie barn and livery stable had caught fire and burned down, and the people were taking a critical look at the Opera House, which is beginning to show the effects of 40 years of heavy use. When it was built, it was the largest public building in the county, and it was the center of multiple major activities ever since. The consensus was that it was time for a replacement. So it was dismantled in 1943, and the materials were used for construction and projects around town. The Playmore Dance Hall east of town met the same fate. Although it was limited to dances, it was still subject to a lot of use. It was dismantled and portions of its roof were used in an auction house in Denison. However, the demands of war began to cut sharply into domestic plans. New construction materials could not be obtained. The plans for a new community building had to be delayed. Other plans were also delayed. Bill Bullenhoff wanted to expand production facilities for his new Schleswig sausage. The original Lutheran church was becoming quite crowded. Several businesses like the John Deere and General Motors dealerships wanted to expand or build new. On the farm, the transition from horsepower to mechanization had made major steps. However, the manufacturing plants were now producing weapons. Farm equipment was not available. Almost all consumer products were restricted and rationed. People needed both ration stamps and cash to buy many things. And ration stamps were not always, or enough ration stamps were not always easy to obtain. The war's end was a huge relief and brought a large surge of good feeling. However, the effects of the war did not end immediately. It took time to revert to peacetime. There were many shortages, and a black market did help some of the problems. Railroad was still going strong, and they had provided a special train to exclusively bring Schleswig cattle to the Chicago stockyards. It was entitled the Blue Ribbon Special. It was an honor to participate in it, but its time was limited. There was talk of a new national paved highway coming right past town. There was a great deal of frustration with getting materials to build new, however, and there were many plans, but there was not the means to fulfill them. A victory celebration was even delayed since the town's Golden Jubilee would be coming soon. When the materials did become available, construction began all over town. And they showed some of the things that were built just all at the same time. New community building, Bill's Market with a meat processing and cold storage locker, new Lutheran church, new John Deere dealership, a new fire station, a new General Motors dealership, a Stockwell Inn Bar and Grill, a new Texaco station, and a new Skelly station all popped up in the community when the materials were here. The Golden Jubilee celebration was set for September 8th, 9th, and 10th of 1949. The community club decided to make it the best celebration any community this size had ever put on. The first step was to organize a calf club for the young people. A program to demonstrate real-world values in cattle feeding was devised. A group would go out west and buy a whole herd of calves, which would then be divided evenly into 5 calf pens. The youngsters would have to draw lots for the pens. The youngsters would then have to negotiate and sign a loan for the calves at the bank. The cattle would then be fed until the celebration, with careful records having to be kept. At the celebration, the calves would be judged by commercial cattle standards, and it would be auctioned to packing plant bidders. Every step was to be as close to real-life cattle feeding as possible. The awards for special features and for the best set of books would be made. It was a unique and impressive program and received wide regional and international recognition. The plans for the Golden Jubilee celebration began a year in advance, and it would be a huge community-wide effort, and promotional tours were sent to all of the adjoining towns. On Thursday, September the 8th, the calves were judged, and a mile-long parade was held, and a State Conservation Commission traveling exhibit was shown. A massive fireworks was displayed. On Friday, September the 9th, a children's parade with extremely elaborate entries was held. An animal oddities display from Ripley'sburg, believe it or not, was shown. And a springtime frolics review was performed. On Saturday, September 10th, the calves were sold at auction. Special acts for the springtime review were performed, and a new Cadillac was sold to the holder of a prize-winning ticket for $5. On all 3 days, the Carl King Band from Fort Dodge performed concerts twice a day. Free acts, including some very specialty acts, were performed each afternoon and each evening. 4 tons of watermelon were given away free each day. Bill Wollenhoff prepared a pit-baked barbecued pork. A wide variety of carnival rides were available at 9 cents a ride. And a big dance was available each evening. There were more activities than could be mentioned here and was considered a huge success. This was the Hollander clothing store float. The reason I selected this float to show was not that it was can't even talk anymore. Not that it was so special, but I think we have to notice the people that were on the float. If you'll notice, it included Jerry Struck and Diana Fredrickson Jarman. There's clear evidence that there are people from here on who are alive, who remember the things that were happening here in town. So from this then will be the end of the forgotten years and the end of this program. But from here on, it is up to you, the people who remember the events, to write the community stories. The Memory Book Committee is giving you the chance to do just that. So thank you for keeping the story alive.